Support for the Nocturnists comes from the California Medical Association.
This season of The Nocturnists is sponsored by the Physicians Foundation. This episode of The Nocturnists is sponsored by the New York Zen Center for Contemplative Care. If you're a physician, advanced practice registered nurse, or physician assistant looking to cultivate well-being and joy in medicine through evidence-based training, learn more at zencare.org/findjoy.
At The Nocturnists, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
You're listening to The Nocturnists, stories from the world of medicine. I'm Emily Silverman. Some people are close to their parents, but how close is too close? We want to love and support each other as we transition from one phase of life to the next. But we also want the freedom to evolve as individuals, to make our own choices and build our own families. In today's story, psychiatrist Carson Brown explores the idea of adulthood and what it means to arrive there, sometimes much later in life than one might expect. In the conversation that follows, Carson and I talk about motherhood, the pain of separating from our children, and the diverging philosophies of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, two giants in the world of psychology. Carson is a psychiatrist in Minneapolis who specializes in anxiety, depression, codependency, and trauma. She incorporates somatic practices, dream work, and guided meditation into her practice. She went to UCSF for medical school and did her residency training at San Mateo County, but also draws inspiration from her undergraduate work in English, where she developed a love for literature and storytelling. Take a listen to Carson's story, Growing Up, which she performed live in Minneapolis in 2023.
So it's this glorious spring day in the San Francisco Bay Area where the trees are blooming. I'm getting a little sunburn on my neck, and I'm over at my brother's house in the Berkeley Hills. My kids are frolicking with their cousins and the dogs, and my husband Scott is grilling with my sister-in-law, and my mom has just arrived. I see her get out of her car, and she's carrying this very heavy cardboard box, and I know exactly what is weighing down this box. It is quiches. My mom makes a lot of quiches, and she brings them to all these family events to send home with all of us. So she's kind of lugging it up, and she manages to kind of wave at the kids, and she's just got this grandmother glow going on. Today's the day I have to make an announcement that I've been postponing and dreading for months. My family is moving from the Bay Area to Minnesota, because it's awesome, where Scott is from. And I've never really left the Bay. I grew up there. I went to college, medical school, psychiatry residency, all within a very tight radius of San Francisco and of my mom. No parent is stoked to get the news that their child is moving away, their grandchildren are moving away. But with my mom, it's kind of this other level. In mental health, in the biz, we have a word for this dynamic between my mom and me, which is enmeshment. Enmeshment, you might want to Google it. What she feels, I feel. It's kind of like being conjoined twins, except instead of sharing parts of our body, we share parts of our psyche. And what happens when a conjoined twin moves away? When I was a very young child, the enmeshment situation was great. We're always together. We're driving around to all my activities. We're singing oldies in harmony in the car. I'm very helpful in collating her League of Women Voters newsletters with her. I'm sitting on the couch, we're watching Jeopardy, and I'm just brushing her long, beautiful hair, and she never wants me to stop. I start to get a little older, and I want to have sleepovers at other people's houses. And she's like, okay, but like only if they sleep over here. Or my senior year of high school, I came home one afternoon after school and saw her standing in front of the mirror trying on my prom dress. And I didn't really have the language to understand how invasive it felt. My junior year of college, I did leave. I did actually leave this one time. I went to England for my junior year of college, and she very quickly came to visit. And we go to Stonehenge, and we're standing in the long shadows, and we're feeling the druid vibe. And she looks at me like really intensely, and she says, "Last time I was here, you were in my womb." It's true, it's a fact. And that night we go out to the pub with my group of friends, and we're having our room temperature flat ale. And one of my friends pulls me aside and is like, "Dude, why is your mom here?" I'm like, "Why isn't your mom here?" Dude, I don't know. So there's only one time, there was one instance where she deviated from this pattern of collapsing the space between us and staying merged. This one instance, it was after my daughter was born. And she came to the hospital and met her. But then for the next month, I did not see her and barely heard from her. I would have told you she would have been banging down my door to get her hands on this baby, but she was nowhere. And I remember I'm nursing my daughter. It's that very worst hour of the day at 4 a.m. And I'm looking at my phone. The attachment parenting books say not to do that, but I'm looking at my phone and I'm looking at this long list of text, invitations to her, photos, and it's just nothing's coming back. And just in that moment, I feel so hungry. The calories of my body are going into this other person. And I fish in the pocket, those glider chairs, rocking chairs. I fish in this cloth pocket and I find one sad pretzel. And it's dry and stale, and I eat it, and it's just very bleak. And all I can think is, I could really go for a quiche right now. I need it. So on the day of my announcement at my brother's house in Berkeley, my mom is sitting in an Adirondack chair, like a queen on her throne, and she's looking out at this priceless view of the Golden Gate, San Francisco skyline, and she says, "This is the best place in the world." She's a diehard Bay Area person, and she hates temperatures below 50. And so I know she's not gonna follow me to Minnesota. But historically, her only other play has been to ghost me. And so I am legitimately scared she's gonna ghost me again, and that this time, this one's big, this could be for good. So I'm paralyzed with fear. And I had a thought, WWMPD. What would my patients do? Because I've seen them go through that. I've accompanied them, my therapy patients, go through this many times. So I start to imagine, what would they say to me if they saw me being a giant hypocrite and not doing what I tell them to do? So I start to hear them in my mind. They're like, "Dr. Brown, remember when I had to move out of my parents' house, but I wanted their approval, I wanted their blessing. You said to me, individuation is not a negotiation." I'm like, did I say that? think I said that. They're like, Dr. Brown, remember when I did not go home for Christmas and I was consumed by guilt, and you said that guilt was a good sign. If I could tolerate it, that guilt was information that I was on the right track doing the heroic work of dismantling dysfunctional intergenerational patterns. That sounds like something I might say. So bad. Dr. Brown, may I remind you of one of your favorite quotes you like to trot out? When you stop people-pleasing, people will not be pleased. Yeah. Okay. So, with my patients as my inspiration, I clinked my glass and said, everybody, I have something very important to tell you. It goes badly. After I very awkwardly kind of get the information out, I look at my mom in that chair and she's like a statue. She will not make eye contact with me. She doesn't say anything. I go and sit on the grass next to her and I put my hand on top of her hand and it's like cold stone. She does not, take my hand back. And pretty soon after that, she leaves. And days pass with no word from her, just silence. And I am unraveling. It appears that the worst case scenario is happening. And I've made an independent decision and I am banished. That's what it looks like. So on day 5 of this silent period, I collapse. I collapse into bed. I'm kind of like diagonal sideways on the bed, my head kind of toward the bottom corner. I'm wearing like those full goblin mode sweats with like one sock, and I'm crying. Like, I'm someone who cries a lot, but this is another level. It's like hemorrhaging, but it's tears and just the whole day. And from my very weird angle on the bed, I'm looking right at my bookshelf that's dedicated to my psychiatry and psychology books that I've collected over like 15 years. And I'm like, what do you got for me, guys? Like, help a sister out, And I grab the book that's closest to me. I open to a random page. Through the blur of tears, I'm like, okay, this is my buddy Carl Jung. He's talking about alchemy, which I always found very esoteric and not applicable. Alchemy, the alchemical transformation of the psyche. And this one word jumps out at me, the negredo. Like the negredo, it's mysterious. It's the first stage of the alchemical transformative process. And it's where the psyche is burned to black ash, unrecognizable. The negredo is just decay, decomposition, putrefaction, chaos, and death. I feel seen. Carl gets it. Carl knows I'm in the negredo. I'm in the negredo. So that night, Scott spoons me, and his heartbeat against my back is a beacon. And over the next couple days, I very slowly start to kind of reconstitute. I'm playing some Uno with my kids. I'm sending Big Lebowski memes back and forth with my brother. I have this kind of epic day at work where everything's working. I think I'm in this raw, undefended state, and my patients are kind of what is going on? But I like it. And the 9th day, I take a hike with my shrink friend. And she knows about the whole situation with my mom in detail. But we don't even really talk about her. We talk about our own pain as moms. We have young kids, but they are already separating. Like the second you cut that cord, they're separating. And it's brutal. And we just we like pinky promise to like support each other in, it's really like grief as we just have to incrementally let them go. And by that 9th night, and I still really want to hear from my mom badly, but I'm like, I might not. And that would be devastating and tragic. And I would survive because I'm not a dependent little girl anymore. I'm a grown-ass woman. It only took 44 years, but it did happen. It's only with that realization, it's in that moment, late on the 9th night, that I get an email from her. And the email is fine. It exists. But my main emotional reaction to it is, I feel so grateful it took her exactly that long to send it, because I needed like every excruciating second in that crucible to alchemize and rebirth myself. Thank you.
I'm sitting here with Carson Brown. Carson, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Emily.
So Carson, one of the things I loved about your story is that it's a relatively intense story, like from a content standpoint. We're talking about mother-daughter dynamics and the pain of individuating from your family and letting go. But your performance was so funny. And I was wondering, did you know that you were this funny?
That's so flattering and nice. I mean, really the only other time I am ever on stage is for karaoke, which I used to really like a lot. And I'm definitely talkative, but definitely not an improv person. I think I'd be terrified of that. And this seemed possible because it was very rehearsed and I very much knew what I thought was going to happen.
Something else I loved about your story is how it gave us a window into your psychoanalytic mind. You're telling the story, but you're also giving us these definitions of these psych terms like enmeshment. And there's that scene at the end where you're crying in bed and you look up and you see the wall of psychiatry books. You pick a book off the shelf and it's Carl Jung, and you start telling us about Carl Jung and the Negredo. And I just loved how educational the story was. In addition to being a story, it kind of helped us understand what it's like to be a psychiatrist. And I was just curious if you could tell us about your journey to psychiatry.
I mean, psychiatry is the best. I love it. And I think almost everyone's interested in it because it's really just the human experience. So those types of details I see as fun sort of for everybody. But I definitely came into medical school thinking I was going to do primary care and interested in integrative medicine. That was sort of how I saw myself initially. But a lot of the advice I got about choosing specialties was find your people. And I liked lots of different people, but I think psychiatrists are people very comfortable with gray area, very comfortable with, more comfortable with not knowing. All of medicine is about the human condition, but something about psychiatry just puts that very front and center. Once I was really exposed to it, it was very clear that's what I wanted to do. That's where I fit.
Do you specialize in any particular type of psychiatry?
And I do general adult psychiatry, so I feel like I see a broad range. But somehow over time, I feel like a lot of my patient panel has I call it complex trauma, which isn't a DSM diagnosis, but it's something that's used more and more of just complex PTSD, meaning not a specific incident, but more like something that we would call developmental trauma or attachment deficits, which respond to both medication and psychotherapy and the combination best. And it's very rewarding work. And then I think this story, plays into certain elements of that too. I think enmeshment is a type of attachment deficit and a developmental issue. Somehow, maybe because it resonates for me, that's a lot of how my practice has taken form.
You mentioned enmeshment is one type of attachment deficit, and that caught my attention because when I think of enmeshment, or at least how you described it in your story, it seems almost like the opposite, like over-attachment rather than an attachment deficit. And so I was wondering if you could tell us more about what it is and how you think about it, and where does that come from? How does it cross over from healthy into unhealthy, and how do you know the difference?
The deficits of enmeshment are just being very, very unclear on what belongs to oneself and what belongs to the other person. What am I responsible for emotionally, and what is the other person responsible for emotionally? And that's just completely scrambled in an enmeshment dynamic and can really cause relationship problems later. For me, mainly in this over-responsibility feeling of I have to manage everybody else's emotions for them. What's really tricky is I think my job as a psychiatrist also pulls me into that role. Like, I'm kind of asked professionally to manage other people's emotions for them, and really trying to learn how to distinguish in personal, but also in these professional relationships. What's my job, and then where does my job end, and the patient takes over, and it's their job. Because definitely starting out, I was bringing very much of a enmeshed vibe to the professional interaction of like, okay, you're here. It's my job to fix your life. It's my job to make sure you never feel bad again. It's my job to contort myself even in this professional relationship. I mean, that'll lead to burnout if you keep doing that. My main motivation has to be acting from my own authenticity rather than my main motivation has to be placating the other person. And it's easy to say, but it's been very hard to unlearn and actually do.
Yeah, I remember once I was having a lot of stress and I used an app to get a massage. I was like, I'm going to do some self-care. So I use this app and this guy shows up at my house with a massage table and he's giving me this massage. And I remember at one point he got to some tension in like my left arm or something. And he was massaging it and he was like, oh. And he was like picking something up. And I was like, what? And he was like, I just feel like whatever this is in your arm, like it's not yours. And I had never really had a massage therapist speak to me that way. And it really got me thinking about like even more than just what we have in our minds or in our heads. Like, how do we understand tensions that are being held in our bodies that aren't even ours to begin with? And so I was wondering if you've ever experimented with that as well. Does the body have anything to offer in helping us understand what is ours and what is not ours and what can be released? I know it's a very like California woo-woo question.
That's me.
But you
That's
are from California.
Yeah. You're asking a whole other really interesting question, which is what all types of somatic therapy really take up, which is the profound ways our bodies actually know so much more than our cerebral cortex. Sometimes it's called bottom-up information that's coming from our viscera up to our brain. Can be so much more informative if we know how to listen to it. Most of us are not acculturated to do that. We culturally really prioritize thinking over emotions and then definitely over sensation, which, people call gut feeling, all kinds of different things. But there's not a definitive answer that it's more just paying attention to sensations and honoring that they contain information. I don't think there's specific sensations necessarily associated with enmeshment globally, but I think for a certain person, you can start to notice that they do have certain patterns of holding when things get activated. And over time, it can help people discern, like, am I doing this authentically or am I doing this to please? Because it can be a hard question to answer. And I have seen people, and I'd love to do it more with myself, really learn, like, I know what it feels like in my body when I'm being authentic, and I know a specific kind of signature fingerprint that comes up for me when it's more like fawning or pleasing or an enmeshed response.
The last part of your story was very nonverbal. You were almost describing an experience that happened in your body where there's the initial terror of disclosing this information to your mother. There's the worst fear realized where your mother responds with, I guess, separation or coldness. And then you talk about laying in bed and you're crying and one sock is off and you're just kind of going through this internal nigredo. You say it's like a process by which the self is burned down to ash and then reconstituted. And it's all happening inside. And you bring us through the different stages of that, where at first you're in a state of despair and then things start to feel a little bit more hopeful and you have like weirdly a good day at work and then you go on this walk with this friend and then it's almost like right as the cycle is completing, you get the email from your mom and you're glad that the email was delayed because it gave you the opportunity to go through that process. And so I'm wondering if you can, I know it's hard probably to put words to, but like what is that process happening internally? It's just like an energetic movement, or what is it that happened?
The entirety of Carl Jung's body of work is trying to answer that, as well as other thinkers and feelers, obviously. But I did use that word crucible towards the end, and he uses another word, the tenemos, which is, a container. And we talk about the container and the frame in psychotherapy a lot.
What's the container and what's the frame?
It's almost just I'm thinking of the word rules, but it's more like the agreements of the psychotherapeutic encounter, the time, the space. We meet from this time to this time on this day. It's almost the ritual of it. It is also the therapist's boundaries. Different therapists and across time ideas about self-disclosure and other types of boundaries do shift. But there are still certain boundaries that a therapist is holding. And the idea is just having this defined space is a chunk of the work. It's not even the talking or the emotive part. It really is. There is this defined space where I do this type of self-reflection. Obviously, there's a lot more to being a therapist than just holding that space, but it is sort of the fundamental requirement and enables everything else to happen. And there is a sense a lot of the times that the psyche has a natural impulse towards self-healing, that it's looking for channels to move in towards healing, towards something more integrated, towards something more comfortable or resolved. And just giving it this type of consistent, compassionate attention, it will unfold in that direction as long as we stay out of the way. So I think, the situation I was describing at the end, it was definitely post-verbal. I think it was so overwhelming and so catastrophic to my psyche that it was not something I could talk about while it was happening. And that's sort of a definition of trauma also, is something that's overwhelming and can't be assigned meaning or processed real time. It's something that's so overwhelming that it outstrips our capacity to do that. But there was a holding space just in my home from my husband. I actually left a line out of the live telling of the story, which was Scott bringing me tea and taking away my snotty tissues. And there was just space for me to collapse, mostly provided by him. The books, I think they are part of the support structures too. I do think that bookshelf meant a lot to me of, I'm probably not the first one going through this. I'm probably not the first one to think about this. There probably is a way to assign some type of structure, meaning, understanding to something that feels unfathomable to me right now. So it was sort of like I was looking for a book to be my life preserver ring thing. And it did happen. I think having any type of word to just grab onto did feel like that life preserver of like, okay, this is at least one way to conceptualize what's happening right now. And there's a comfort. That was a humor I was kind of going for, is that even though it was so horrible, your psyche being burned to ash, that they're basically the worst thing, that there was something comforting in having that described. I think that's what we try to do as therapists too, is we'll float out, oh, do you mean this? Or is it this type of thing? Or is it this word? And a lot of times people are like, no, that's not quite it. But sometimes they'll be like, exactly, yes, thank you. And you do feel it as like a sustenance for somebody, as a ballast.
Was that a term that you had heard before in your studies, or was it something that you just came across for the first time in that moment?
My 4th year of residency training, I was at the San Francisco Jung Institute for the whole year, as about a third of my time was there. I had psychotherapy patients through them, and they had their own set of didactics. So even all of that time was like scratching the surface. And they have an entire psychoanalytic training program. So it was really just the introduction. But I had spent a lot of time with his work and then contemporary Jungian thinkers also. So I definitely had been exposed to it before. There's a really brief line I say in the story that I hadn't found it applicable before. His most esoteric stuff is around these alchemy processes. And prior to having my own experience of this, I was like, how do I apply it? And it had felt too esoteric to me before. It had felt a little ungrounded. But then I was like, oh, it does match up to actual phenomena. I think it just hadn't clicked for me. He's so abstracted, and, so much of his work is about symbols that sometimes connecting it back to day-to-day modern life, it takes a little translating, but then it made a lot of sense in that moment.
He's such a famous person in the psych literature. I think probably Freud and Jung are the two, big names. For people who have maybe heard those names before but aren't really sure what the one-liner is for what each of them believed, or their theories, or I think their theories might even come into conflict with each other. But is there a way to boil down some of these Jungian approaches versus Freudian approaches? Or is it more that they had like many different theories and philosophies, and you can only really get it if you do a deep dive?
Yeah, probably something in between. I'm feeling slightly daunted trying to give a one-liner, but I'll try. They are some of the OGs, of the whole field, which is super important and impressive in certain ways. And also they were very much products of their time and place and intersections of various identities. And so a lot of the time since then has been mostly critiquing, unpacking, modernizing. There's a lot that's problematic is sort of the short way to say it. There's anti-Semitism, there's sexism, there's all kinds of difficult stuff in there. And there are some of the building blocks of the whole field. So, what I say about Freud sometimes is he was the first person in the Western tradition. There were plenty of other thinkers and people having all kinds of different experiences in different parts of the world. But he was really the first European to say the unconscious mind exists. So that was on the level of Copernicus to me, of someone asserting something that basically everyone else thinks is crazy at the time. Copernicus at least had telescopes and other instruments and mathematics to back him up. The unconscious, how do we can't measure, see, directly perceive it kind of by definition. So someone saying this thing that's unperceivable exists was, not to overstate it, a complete turning point in European thought. And then, yes, he and Jung were close colleagues. Jung was basically Freud's right-hand man. And then they had a major schism, which happens repeatedly through the history of psychiatry and psychology. People get pretty heated about these topics, My one-liner on Jung, people have probably heard collective unconscious, so he did take this idea of the unconscious and be like, it's not just seated in each individual mind. There's also a collective or societal level of it. And that's what he thought about. Archetypes and themes that you find running through all cultures really fascinated him. It's fascinating. How did all these different groups of people come up with similar symbols or similar ways of thinking about things? So that's one of his major contributions. I also just think of him as really bringing symbol and how symbols operate. That was one of his major contributions too. And that comes up a lot in dreams. A lot of people, when they think of Jung, their word association to him, which he did word association work, but a lot of times the word association to Jung is dreams, because he saw dreams as the way our unconscious communicates with us, but that the language of the unconscious is not literal, it's symbolic. And whereas Freud was sort of like, well, if someone dreams about feces, that is money. It was sort of a one-to-one symbol to meaning. Jung was very much more like, no, the symbol is individual to the person and has to be teased out and understood in the context of that person.
In your practice, I mean, you seem to be really interested in the therapy side of psych. So, psychoanalysis and Freud and Jung, and kind of talking through things, using symbol, using story to help people heal and make sense of their experience. Do all psychiatrists build that into their work, or do you feel like sometimes the field splits off where it's like the psychiatrists are dealing with the pills and it's the therapists, who maybe aren't physicians, but who are trained in therapy, who are doing the talk therapy and doing some of these other things? What is it like in your practice? And are you unique, or do you feel like most psychiatrists veer more toward like the medical approach as opposed to some of this more, I guess, abstract approach?
Right. I mean, I think more and more it's becoming the MD psychiatrists prescribe and non-MD therapists do the therapy. I think that's the way insurance companies want it. I think there's financial incentive for psychiatrists to work that way. I went to an unusual residency program at San Mateo County that is a gem of a program, if anyone's looking for one, that really does emphasize psychotherapy, and people have long-term psychotherapy cases starting in the second year, and there's a lot of psychotherapy training. My understanding is that at most psychiatry programs, that's being whittled, and it is becoming more solely focused on psychopharmacology, and then also interventions like TMS, ECT, the higher tech interventions. So my residency program was unusual. And then where I work now at Baywell Psychiatry Group is also unusual, that we are a group of psychiatrists and psychologists, but psychiatrists are encouraged, supported to do as much psychotherapy as they want. So we have the flexibility to do that. And it's a personal financial decision. You can make more money doing just meds, but that decision is left to everyone to make individually and is not dictated by the practice. So it has attracted a group of providers who are very interested in psychotherapy. And we have monthly psychotherapy case conferences and lots of consultants who come in, and we get to do lots of fun psychotherapy stuff. So I like to preserve the combination. I think patients really like having a one-stop shop, but the same person who prescribes to them is also their therapist. People really like that. And then I definitely think it makes me a better prescriber. It's not a checklist of someone's symptoms. It's an ongoing in-depth conversation about the nuances of people's experience. Evidence studies have shown us that the combination is the most effective. And then it doesn't have to be in the same person, but there is something special about being the person to do both.
Patients often wonder about their therapists or their psychiatrists and their personal lives and their problems.
Totally.
And one of the funniest parts of your story was, as you're dealing with your own problems, you're actually having memories of patients who you've talked to, who you've coached, who you've even coached through problems similar to the one you're going through. Do you ever wonder about them wondering about you? And how do you think about that one-sidedness of the equation versus maybe like flipping it around? And in this case, it was like the patients almost were inspiring you in a reverse way.
I am so curious about my own therapists. I'm always just like, what is their life like? And, how do they? And there are so many different schools of thought about it. More old school was, the therapist is a blank screen. The therapist can't reveal anything because then that tampers with what the patient can project onto you. And, some people still practice that way. The more people have gotten the postmodern memo about there not being any objective space to occupy, that there's a whole field of psychological thought called intersubjectivity. So I'm fully in this postmodern intersubjective school of thought of there's no way to not bring yourself into it. And that it's not a matter of trying to eradicate that. It's a matter of trying to be aware of it and make sure it's not interfering in the patient's process. So then that informs a lot of people's decisions about, I think I used the term earlier, self-disclosure, how much to say about yourself. And I definitely don't tell patients this story. I've wondered what would happen if a patient runs across this podcast or whatever else. When patients have experience that is similar to mine, I have to really remind myself that it might be similar, but it is not the same. And they are not the same as me. That there can be a real temptation to just directly map my experience onto them, assume their response to things is the same as my response to things. So there really does have to be a tapping of the brakes. That said, my patients inspire me every day, and I learn from them every day. I said this to one of my supervisors at the Jung Institute. I said to her very sheepishly and kind of like thinking I was doing something wrong, I was like, I'm really learning a lot, not just about psychotherapy, but about like my own life from this one patient in particular who was going through something. And I felt kind of guilty about that, like I wasn't supposed to be getting anything out of it. And my supervisor, with a real lightness, was like, "Oh yeah, it's just one of the perks. Yeah, that's just one of the perks of the job. Like, this is a tough job. Of course we need to, of course there got to be some perks." And yeah, so she really normalized it. She was just like, obviously, we're sitting with people all day grappling with deep human struggles. Of course we're going to glean something from that, and that there's nothing wrong with that.
I want to come back to your story. There's a scene toward the end where you're walking with a friend and you don't discuss what happened with your mom, but you do discuss the pain of separating from one's children. I think you say something in the story about how as soon as they're born, it's just a gradual process of separation. And as somebody who's a relatively new mother, I really connected to that. And it reminded me of this moment shortly after my daughter was born. She must have been, 6 or 8 weeks old or something like that. And the in-laws came to visit, and she was lying on her back on this playmat, and they were playing with her, and I was there, and then I had to go to the bathroom. So I stepped away, I went to the bathroom, and when I came back, they were all like smiling and laughing. And something had happened, like my daughter had done something silly or funny or made a face, and they had had some kind of experience, and I hadn't been a part of it. And I just remember it felt so strange that my baby, my daughter, had had an experience that I hadn't been a part of after, obviously 9 months of literally being the same being.
I think this is such a journey of parenthood. I think there's a specific wrinkle for the birthing parent because of what you said, that the baby is literally contained in your body for a period of time, and there is a physical then separation at birth. So there's a specific wrinkle to that, but I think even for the non-birthing parent who also bonds so closely, that there's a similar process. I'm not to the point of some of my empty nester friends where they really leave home, but I hear from them and I hear from other people, and I have felt that I think it's pretty much our hardest job as parents is allowing the separation. And it gives me a ton of empathy for my mom and for anyone else. I understand how an enmeshed dynamic comes about because it's extremely difficult and extremely painful. So of course people want to short circuit it or avoid it. Who wouldn't want to do that? I called it grief in the story. I think that's the most accurate word I have, but there are probably a lot of them. Yeah, we're going to miss things. We're going to not understand things about them. There are going to be things about them we just never even know. And it's just a huge adjustment. There's a huge benefit to doing it too. Sometimes my kids say to me, because I love babies and I just want to see babies and snuggle them all the time. And they say, "You wish we were still babies." And I pause and I'm like, I actually don't, because if you stayed babies, I wouldn't get to see these amazing 9 and 12-year-olds, And so it doesn't erase the grief or pain, but it at least is alongside it, is like, wow, I get to see this person blossom. And that's the reward for tolerating the very real grief and pain.
How is living in Minneapolis after living in the Bay Area for so long?
It's 1 degree today.
One
is kind of, I think 1 is the funniest temperature. Sometimes I say it is a degree, or I was joking recently, when the high is a negative number, I won't call it a high, but I'm loving it. It's wonderful here. I think it's really enlivening to kind of have beginner's mind about a place. I mean, we're going dog sledding next weekend, and yesterday we're at these barrel saunas by a lake, and we're doing cold plunge into through a hole in the frozen lake. And I was like, I've never done this before. I wouldn't have done this. So I found it really enlivening to have a change at this point in my life, and it's a really beautiful place.
Well, Carson, I just want to thank you so much for telling your story with the Nocturnists and coming in to chat with me today. I've just so enjoyed this conversation. I feel like I've probably gotten a little therapy out of it myself. So thanks again for coming on and for being here.
Thanks. It was a really profound experience for me to get to do it. So I'm just so grateful for the opportunity and for today too. Thank you.
This episode of The Nocturnists was recorded by Aerial View Studio in Minneapolis and produced, edited, and mixed by Sam Osborne. Today's story was coached by Molly Rose Williams and Kristen Moe and performed live at the Nocturnist show REBIRTH at the Parkway Theater in Minneapolis in April of 2023 in partnership with the Center for the Art of Medicine at the University of Minnesota. Our executive producer is Allie Block. Our head of story development is Molly Rose Williams, and Ashley Pettit is our program manager. Our original theme music was composed by Joseph Monroe, and additional music comes from Blue Dot Sessions. The illustrations for this season of The Nocturnists are by Stephanie Singleton. The Nocturnists is made possible by the California Medical Association, a physician-led organization that works tirelessly to make sure the doctor-patient relationship remains at the center of medicine. To learn more about the CMA, visit cmadocs.org. This season of The Nocturnists is sponsored by the Physicians Foundation, which empowers physicians to lead in the delivery of high-quality, cost-efficient healthcare by attending to physician well-being, supporting medical practices sustainability, and helping physicians navigate the changing healthcare system. The Nocturnists is also made possible by donations from listeners like you. Thank you so much for supporting our work in storytelling. If you enjoy listening, please like, share, subscribe, and help others find us by giving us a rating and review in your favorite podcast app. To contribute your voice to an upcoming project or to make a donation, visit our website at thenocturnist.com. I'm your host, Emily Silverman. Until next time.